The Louvre, the world's largest museum in the heart of Paris. 72,000 square meters of exhibition space housed in a palace that took 800 years to build.
The historic Louvre interiors that go back centuries are definitely part of the collection.
There is probably no other building which can even match it. It was the residence of the kings.
From the 12th century on, the kings of France have built and developed a castle, then a palace, the largest in Europe. 210,000 square meters, the equivalent of 30 football fields.
The Louvre is a portion of the city. It's much more than a building. Therein lies its greatness and its difficulty.
A vast palatial domain with rooms of massive proportions. 460 meters for the Grande Galerie and a ceiling 30 meters high in the Salon de Nons. From the Middle Ages to the 21st century, the Louvre has evolved with each successive regime, reflecting hugely different architectural styles.
As we pursue the renovations, we have to both modify and at the same time fit into an existing system, and that's very complicated for architects.
To echo the sovereign's dreams of grandeur and beauty, architects have used state-of-the-art technology and innovative materials.
For the Louvre, with each generation, we want the very best.
The Louvre has always been at the cutting edge of modernity.
As with the original Louvre castle, the pyramid, which has come to symbolize the museum throughout the world, is an unprecedented technological and architectural feat.
The structure of the pyramid is a totally innovative structure that had not existed before.
That's what the Louvre is, architectural audacity at the service of heritage.
The story of the Louvre is told through its transformations. A gigantic construction site punctuated with revolts and tragedies, an architectural adventure that we're about to discover from behind the scenes. Today, the Louvre has 10 million visitors wandering through a maze of rooms and corridors. In all, 14 kilometers of perfectly studied routes for observing nearly 40,000 artworks. The museum comprises 22 escalators, 75 elevators, and 10,000 stairs. Figures to make your head spin, with just as many different services.
Restaurants, cafeterias, coat rooms, auditoriums, special rooms for children, equipment for the blind. We now have a functional building in the sense that the crowds are welcomed, channeled, and distributed. It's become a much more efficient museum machine.
Much more efficient in that the Louvre Museum has made an astonishing comeback.
In the 60s and 70s, basically the Louvre Museum and Palace weren't very well maintained.
It's a very long, very unwieldy building. There's no centrality, so it's not clear where to go in.
In 1981, the museum was an immense L with 31,000 square meters of exhibition space. Jacques Lang, the newly elected Minister of Culture, made a proposal to take over the Richelieu wing, which until then had housed the Ministry of Finances. Lang's idea turned the Louvre into the largest museum in the world.
That was the spirit of the memo I sent to the president, entitled The Grand Louvre, or For a Grand Louvre. And I said, think, if we go ahead with this, the Louvre would become the biggest and most beautiful museum in the world.
Ieoh Ming Pei, the highly renowned Chinese-American architect, was chosen for the project, christened the Grand Louvre. First step, give the museum an entrance. The entrance would be the pyramid, a major transformation in the architectural adventure. Nothing could be left to chance, starting with its location in the center of the new museum, which changed from an L shape to a huge U.
The illogical place, if it's three great wings of the Louvre, like forming this shape, would be to put it in the middle, right there. Best place to do that would be underground, and then connect with three passageways to each of the three wings.
The depth of the lobby was settled upon at 9 meters for 2,000 square meters of surface area.
The challenge was to take visitors down into a vast lobby that didn't have an underground feel to it, like a subway station.
Well, if it was underground, it would need light. So The idea came to my father to have effectively a big skylight, which would also be the entrance.
It was no small constraint to respect the view of an 800-year-old palace. Doing so ruled out the idea of a square or dome. The architects set their sights on the most logical shape, the pyramid. Now it was a question of dimensions. The architects made calculation after calculation, height, base, and most importantly, the slope, which proved to be a real brain teaser.
45 degrees looked like it was melting. We could make it more pointy. That felt too aggressive.
The solution lay 3,000 kilometers away in Egypt, realm of the pharaohs, the greatest builders of all time. Pei drew inspiration from the most famous pyramid in the world, the Great Pyramid of Giza.
After quite a lot of study, the Pyramid of Giza came to a proportion which is mathematically very close to a golden section proportion.
Though Pei kept the proportions of the Great Pyramid, he obviously had to reduce its size. The glass pyramid of the Louvre would be 21 meters tall and have a square base of 34 meters to create an angle of 51 degrees, exactly like the Pharaoh's pyramid. In 1984, Pei's team unveiled their scale models to experts, politicians, and the general public. The Grand Louvre project immediately sparked a debate.
Personnellement, je n'approuve pas le mélange des genres.
Ça, c'est moderne, mais c'est joli. Encore un petit
Ça
diamant
n'avait
posé
pas
sur
besoin
la-
de ça
Je trouve ça terrible.
pour la publicité du Louvre.
Je la trouve très chouette.
Atroce.
The pyramid was a shock because it's glass. People said it's an international aesthetic, an American aesthetic. They said it's a technical object.
People thought that, well, this is the most perfect building, the most perfect space. We have to leave it exactly like it was. You cannot touch the Louvre.
And yet, for centuries, the walls of the Louvre have been moving. Excavations made for the museum renovation project would bring the foundations of the first castle back to light, built 800 years ago. Massive towers and long stone walls. Here we are 8 meters below the Cour Carrée courtyard, at the foot of the ancient fortress that was the original Louvre. Our architectural adventure begins in the Middle Ages.
Paris was a capital, the capital of a kingdom of France much smaller than today's France, and it was a capital under threat by the English. The English were just 60 kilometers from Paris. And so, King Philippe Auguste in 1190, before he set off on the Crusades, decided to protect his capital and erected a wall around the city.
The wall stopped at the Seine. On the right bank, the king built a fortress to reinforce the vulnerable spot and prevent assailants from getting in.
The first Louvre castle was in no way a residence for the king. It really was a kind of garrison, an exclusively military edifice.
The first square, very conventionally, consisted of a fortified bastion with sides measuring roughly 75 to 80 meters, with a keep in the center. An enormous tower 30 meters tall and 15 meters in diameter, a monumental construction.
The stones for the Louvre were ferried in by boat from the quarries of Paris and the Oise region.
The Louvre is made of very high-quality limestone, very fine and highly water-resistant. That's what was used to build the walls of the Louvre, and it's one of the Louvre's unifying factors.
Until the 19th century, the stones of the Louvre would come from the same quarries. For 600 years, the castle was built using this noble material mined from the ground beneath Paris. And for his fortress, besides the handsome stones, King Philippe Auguste could also count on the knowledge and expertise of his craftsmen.
Philippe Auguste's fortress benefited from the logistics and prolific workforce that had developed around the extraordinary activity of cathedral building.
It would take about 10 years to build the square fortress. In 1202, it was the first piece of the puzzle to form the Grand Louvre as we know it today. 2 centuries later, with the urban expansion of Paris, a new city wall was erected to protect its recently developed districts. The Louvre castle found itself inside the enclosure.
From then on, the city surrounded the castle, so the castle no longer served a defensive purpose.
In 1364, Charles V decided to transform the military fortress into a royal residence.
The transformation of the castle into a residence was visible from the outside, because certain parts of the edifice were raised and large windows were opened in the walls which had previously been fortified.
Charles V took over this spot of power and said, "Here I am. I'm the strongest, and I'm replacing all this with another kind of strength, intelligence and refinement."
Charles V was called the Wise King. He was lettered and would create a library, complete with ornate woodwork and extending 3 stories high, which held over 900 works.
To the north, an architectural element made its grand appearance, the garden.
Before that, it was a fortified castle. There was no garden because there was no reason for one. And then there arose the inseparable coupling between royal residence, a palace, and garden. The pairing became a defining element of French composition.
Despite all the comforts brought to the Louvre, the royal residence would be abandoned by Charles V's successors, who fled Paris when it was under siege during the 100 Years' War. It wasn't until the 16th century, in the more peaceful context of the Renaissance, that a new chapter in the history of the Louvre was written. 200 years after the last renovations that turned the fortress into a royal residence, Henry II longed to compete with the impressive achievements of his European rivals.
The medieval Louvre undoubtedly seemed like a rather dated, old-fashioned chateau in terms of the modernity of the new architecture that was developing in Italy and in France.
The Louvre's massive tower was demolished, along with the West Wing. Then, in 1546, it was rebuilt on the super foundations of the medieval fortress. The Lescaut Wing, named for its architect, is one of the most beautiful vestiges of this era. It lies in the Louvre Cour Carrée.
The reconstructed edifice was marked mainly by a new sense of regularity. The ensemble of the facade is now defined by geometry. Windows are distributed symmetrically, and the front door is in the center of the facade.
We're no longer dealing with technological challenges or Gothic architecture. We know how to build. So where do the concerns lie? With style, decoration, ornamentation.
The facade is decorated with numerous sculptures, all to the glory of the king.
We also note the use of new forms inspired by antiquity, forms we see on monuments in Italy. They were used here to decorate the facade, particularly the columns.
At the king's request, Pierre Lescaut created a supplementary half-story and a mansard roof. The upper part of the roof was no longer pointed, but flat with a small terrace. This prototype, built at the Louvre, was the first of its kind in Paris and would go on to be used in several buildings throughout the capital.
The transition from the medieval Louvre to the Renaissance Louvre was radical. Take the interior distributions, for example. One thing that radically changed were the stairways. Medieval stairs were all spiral staircases.
These staircases, an incredible innovation from the Middle Ages, were real space savers with their narrow steps spiraling around a central axis. But during the Renaissance, the staircase evolved beyond a simple tool for getting around. It became an element of prestige. At the northern extremity of the building, Pierre Lescaut built a highly modern straight staircase for the Louvre. Gone was the spiral, and in its place, a direct path from one floor to the next. The result was magnificent.
The formal procedures of the court required layouts where people could walk several abreast, where the king's appearance could be dramatized. For instance, him walking down the stairs. It's not the Folie Bergère, but almost. We're already in a narrative of representation.
From his apartments, the king would walk down this richly decorated staircase to his immense 450 square meter grand ballroom. A room which today is devoted to masterpieces of ancient sculpture.
The Salle des Caryatides was designed to be a majestic ballroom with a balcony for musicians. This made it the ideal setting for all sorts of events.
The musician's balcony is supported by 4 caryatides. These columns of Roman inspiration in the form of female figures were sculpted for the first time at the Louvre.
Pierre Lescaut's work was immediately perceived as a sort of manifesto of French architecture, of an almost unsurpassable horizon.
Under Henry II, only the west and south wings were rebuilt. As the chateau continued its slow transformation, another construction project located to the west would alter the structure of the Louvre. In 1559, Henry II died accidentally in a tournament. His wife, Catherine de Médicis, took the reins of the Valois dynasty. She governed in place of her children in a complicated political context.
It was the start of the wars of religion. Issue was taken with royalty, and the Queen wanted to mark the presence of kings in the capital. For this reason, she purchased land about 500 meters west of the Louvre.
The Queen Mother had a palace built opposite the Louvre Chateau. Since it was located on the other side of Charles V's wall, it was completely independent. Her new residence was erected where a former Tuileries, a tile manufacturer, used to stand, thus providing the name for her palace, the Tuileries. It was endowed with a vast garden which still exists today.
The garden was very big, 300 meters long, and consequently the palace that was to stand before the garden had to be the same length. It was a considerable shift of scale in terms of what already existed on the Louvre site, because Lescaut's facade was only 60 meters long. Her inaugural move changed the entire scale of the site.
The Tuileries was still under construction when Paris was struck by the wars between Catholics and Protestants. Catherine de Médicis tried to appease the tension by organizing festivities in her nearby chateau, the Louvre.
The Louvre was a place of celebration and leisure, but also a place where tragic events took place, particularly on St. Bartholomew's Day, August 24th, 1572.
Everyone was gathered in the Caryatides ballroom to celebrate the wedding of Catherine de Médicis' Catholic daughter Margot to Protestant Henri de Navarre, the future Henry IV.
Sometimes it's said that the wedding was a kind of fireworks in a powder keg, and that's exactly what it was. The Catholic leaders decided to eliminate the main members of the Protestant party.
The situation quickly went from bad to worse, spilling outside the Louvre to become a genuine massacre throughout the city.
Over 3,000 Protestants were killed throughout Paris, and this actually sparked off a massacre that spread throughout France.
The walls of the Louvre would long resonate with the screams and howls from this night of horror. When Henry IV took the throne in 1589, he found himself facing a huge task: putting an end to the Civil War and establishing the new Bourbon dynasty, of which he was the founder.
He was a disputed monarch because he had very distant ties to his predecessors, the Valois. He also had to reaffirm his presence in the capital and prove himself to be the worthy successor of the Valois kings who were there before him.
40 years after the initial construction work on the Tuileries, the king decided to build the greatest palatial complex in Europe. The architectural program involved quadrupling the Cour Carrée, completing the Tuileries Palace, and connecting it to the Louvre. Henry IV's grand design, depicted in this period illustration, became the reference for every subsequent French monarch who would try to meet the challenge of this incredible construction.
It was no longer about redoing the Louvre to change it from a medieval castle. It became a question of planning an entire site that comprised a garden as well as an entire district between the Louvre and the Tuileries, which in fact meant acquiring all the homes that stood there. It was an absolutely monumental project for a monarchy.
The king had less power than a republican state. He didn't have the right to kick people out by force. That was absolutely unthinkable. Otherwise, there'd be an immediate uprising from the people. So the development happened to the south where the river was, which was also free.
The wall along the Seine was destroyed and a colossal construction project began, the Grande Galerie, the first extension to the palace.
The Grand Gallery that links the Tuileries, the Queen's Palace to the King's Palace, is exceptional for its size and its length. It's practically half a kilometer long. At this scale, it's no longer a building. It's a portion of the city.
The construction site was gargantuan for the time. The scale of Paris, which was still a medieval city in terms of its narrow streets and its density. All of a sudden, we have a rectilinear dimension, completely out of line with the site.
Starting in 1595, hundreds of workers were mobilized to build this two-storied gallery that joined the Louvre to the Tuileries. The immense construction project, which lasted 13 years, benefited the entire city of Paris.
Today, we don't really realize it. The Seine is flanked with quays, so everything is channeled in an extremely precise manner. That wasn't the case at all back then. The gallery along the water also had an urban function. It gave a neatness to the riverbank and solidity, because there was a need for infrastructure. That's mainly what the work was.
On the upper floor of the 460-meter-long edifice, the king could now stroll the full length of the hallway in complete security. The ground floor was reserved for artists.
Painters, sculptors, engravers, silversmiths. 27 studios were created for artists. It was a place to display the collections that represented the king's power, his taste, and his role in society.
For Henry IV, it was a small museum before its time, and certain statues from the period can still be viewed today, like this Diana with a deer or David and Goliath. The king's project was brutally interrupted when in 1610 he was assassinated by a fanatic in the street just outside the Louvre. The death of Henry IV didn't spell the end of his grand design. On the contrary, every succeeding monarch would be obsessed with completing the project of the vast palace.
It became a genuine political issue. The sign of success and effectiveness of a regime was to be able to complete the Louvre. What also made it quite complicated was that as the renovations were successfully pursued, it was necessary to both modify and fit it to an existing system, which is very complicated for architects.
Completing Henry IV's gargantuan project was far from easy. The surface area of the Louvre courtyard had to be multiplied by 4, so the small chateau needed to be expanded. But there was a problem. It wasn't at all intended to welcome such a large courtyard. But those obstacles didn't frighten Louis XIII. In 1639, the king began by doubling the facade of the Lescaut wing, the new west side of the square, now stretching 120 meters.
They didn't want to destroy the unity and beauty of Lescaut's model, so they decided to double it. But doubling it meant creating a line that was too long and monotonous. So how could they do that in an intelligent manner?
Jacques Lemercier, the architect in charge of designing the extension, came up with the idea of a pavilion in the center.
A new symmetrical axis was created. He then invented the model of the much higher central pavilion.
45 meters tall, the highest point of the Louvre.
Some people viewed the new pavilion as more or less the successor of the medieval keep that had disappeared. In addition, the keep was topped with a rather special dome because it's square and there are ridges on 4 sides. That dome would become a model for royal architecture.
When Louis XIII died in 1643, only the west wing of the Cour Carrée was completed. But the renovations underway already announced the major works of his son, Louis XIV, one of the greatest constructors of the Louvre. Louis XIV was only a child when the kingdom was shaken by revolts. It was only in 1652 that Regent Anne of Austria and her son were able to enter the capital.
They moved into the Louvre, which was a highly fortified palace, but not necessarily a very comfortable one. The first renovations therefore consisted of providing a bit more comfort for the king and his mother.
In the small gallery on the ground floor, the queen had an apartment put in, with 6 rather sumptuous rooms. A few years later, Louis XIV, now 23 years old, had a reception hall built upstairs.
Charles Lebrun, Louis XIV's chief painter, would decorate thousands of square meters of vaults, and to do so, he would gather a team of specialized painters and sculptors to create a grand décor.
The theme of the decor was the sun god Apollo, which glorified the figure of Louis XIV.
For us today, the association of Louis XIV with the sun seems perfectly natural. Nevertheless, you have to realize that it was developed at the beginning of Louis XIV's reign, right at the time when this decor was being created, essentially at the Louvre.
The expansion projects continued. Inside as well as outside, the palace looked less and less like the plans of the medieval Louvre. The surface area of the small cour carrée grew considerably, reaching beyond the base perimeter of the original fortress foundations. By 1665, 3 of the 4 sides of the new chateau surrounded the huge 14,000 square meter courtyard. The east wing still had to be built, and it was the most important, since it would contain the entrance to the palace.
Today you enter the Louvre from the west. The pyramid is in the Cour Napoleon. But in Louis XIV's time, that was the side with the kitchens. The main facade was the one looking out at Paris. Thus he wanted to develop the most beautiful facade one could imagine for the greatest monarch in Europe gazing out at his city.
What would come to be a masterpiece of French classicism began by triggering a battle of architects. To ensure the best possible project, Colbert, Louis XIV's Minister of Arts, consulted numerous French as well as foreign architects.
To start, he chose the most famous European artist of the day, which was Bernini. Bernini made several proposals. He came to France to get his project started, and he laid the first stone. But as soon as he left, everything ground to a halt. Everything stopped because the project didn't seem convincing enough to Colbert. He felt it wasn't adapted to French standards.
The project that was finally settled upon was the colonnade, designed by a consortium of French architects consisting of Charles Lebrun, Claude Perrault, and Louis Levaux.
Levaux and Perrault composed a classical facade that was extremely sober, extremely elegant, and particularly immense, with a colonnade that joined 2 floors. And 2 floors at the Louvre Palace was already quite large. It was an act worthy of the Sun King.
The large facade, stretching nearly 175 meters long, is structured by Corinthian columns 13 meters high. Despite the monumental entrance, Louis XIV chose to move to Versailles, leaving the Louvre half-finished. Certain walls lacked floors and ceilings. When the king moved out in 1682, only the Tuileries had been completed.
The question then arose what to do with the palace when the king no longer comes to visit.
The Louvre underwent a radical change of vocation and became a temple of art. Academies of painting and sculpture moved into the royal apartments and organized exhibitions. The idea of a museum, which grew slowly under the ancient regime, would finally become a reality 100 years later with the French Revolution. August 10, 1792, thousands of revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries, the seat of royal power and symbol of the absolute monarchy. By the end of this bloody day, the mob had taken over the palace to govern there. The First Republic was born.
With the revolution, there was a sort of division between the 2 palaces. The Tuileries once again became the seat of power. Over at the Louvre, cultural activities remained very important.
Part of the Louvre Palace was transformed into a museum. On August 10, 1793, the Central Museum of the Republic's Arts was inaugurated in the Grande Galerie.
Under the monarchy, works were exhibited so the public could see them. But under the revolution, a different notion emerged, the idea that the works belong to the people. That's a major difference.
There were 600 paintings displayed in rather basic conditions in a gallery with green-painted walls and a poor-quality floor. It was the start of the Louvre, but at the same time, it was a very small start.
A small start compared to the tidal wave of works that filled the museum a year after its opening. Thousands of works flowed in from all over Europe. The countries conquered by the Republic's armies were cleaned out, aristocrats and clergy robbed of their finest collections. The Louvre's new challenge was to find thousands of square meters of space to accommodate all the newly acquired paintings and sculptures. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of France. He took up residence in the Tuileries, where the main pathway was crowned with the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel. The new emperor's ambition was to fulfill the grand design. He wanted to succeed where the kings before him had failed.
For Napoleon, the Louvre and the Tuileries were an important issue. He lived in the Tuileries, so he had the Louvre right out his window, but also because throughout the 18th century, criticism toward the monarchy had developed for their failure to complete the Louvre.
The Tuileries and the Louvre were linked to the south by Henry IV's Grande Galerie, but Napoleon also wanted to connect the 2 palaces to the north with a second gallery. But the emperor was confronted with another reality.
The presence of neighborhoods all around the Louvre. You can't think of the Louvre as it is today, very open with lots of space around it. It was actually inserted into a series of inns and houses that were pressing right up along the facades. And when Napoleon arrived, he really decided to fit into this palace.
Napoleon I began major construction work and demolished numerous houses in order to build his North Gallery. Starting in 1807, a first half was built, measuring 200 meters. In the Cour Carrée, the work that had stopped under Louis XIV was finally completed. Ceilings were finally put in and the facades were ornately sculpted.
The work carried out at the beginning of the 19th century would have a major impact on the architectural history of the palace.
Napoleon's architects Percier and Fontaine came up with a new style, Neoclassicism, which would inspire many of their successors.
Percier and Fontaine, for the first time, would set up a very rich decor as opposed to what had been seen under the Revolution, which was quite simple. So there was gold, bronze, marble, and also some materials like stone.
Noble materials as well as impressive columns were the trademarks of Percier and Fontaine's style. Their aim was to impress through beauty and grandeur of the constructions. And it was no coincidence that Napoleon I decided to celebrate his second wedding in the Grande Galerie, newly renovated by his architects.
It was a long path for the wedding procession to walk down through the Grande Galerie. We can see during the wedding the close ties between the collections, the museum, and the life of the empire and the emperor. The museum was enhanced by the emperor's conquests, and Napoleon could stage himself in this artistic decor.
At the time, the Mona Lisa was already a resident. On display in the Grande Galerie, she had a front row seat for the proceedings. This auspicious period for the empire and the museum wouldn't last. In 1815, the defeat of Napoleon's armies led to the definitive collapse of his regime. Victors throughout Europe demanded the immediate restitution of their pillaged works. In 1852, Napoleon III, at the head of the Second Empire, wanted to complete the grand design devised by Henry IV 250 years ago. He decided to turn the Louvre into an immense palace with a museum worthy of its collections.
He had an ambitious project, which was to complete the north wing begun by Napoleon I. He would increase room for lodging as well as the life of the court, plus for government and the museum, which was continually growing.
There wasn't much time. The work had to be completed for the First World's Fair, which would be held in Paris in 3 years' time. To meet the challenge, the emperor entrusted the work to architects Visconti, then Le Fuel.
He would succeed where others had failed. What made this possible was France's great economic health at the time, and also the new industrialization of architecture, which made it possible to manage a huge work site.
With the arrival of the railroad, for the first time, stones for the Louvre were brought in from a more distant quarry, in Lorraine. 3,000 workers toiled round the clock in shifts 7 days a week to build the final pieces of the puzzle.
The two palaces that had been erected in a totally independent and separate manner, because of the densely developed Paris districts between them, would finally be joined. And that was a small miracle.
The final houses were demolished and 2 wings were built. The Louvre was a complete enclosure. In its center, a large courtyard, the Cour Napoléon. Like his predecessors, architect Le Fuel had to integrate his new Louvre into the architecture of past centuries. While the bulk of the work was completed in 1855, they now had to fill out the additional 21,000 square meters. Le Fuel began his Herculean task with the construction of monumental staircases.
The Molière staircase, the Daru staircase, which was greatly modified later on. Stairs that were meant for movement, but also as places of display with a highly original decor.
The stairways served the sumptuous reception halls of his State Department, as well as the 132 rooms of the museum, decorated and outfitted to receive the greatest masterpieces.
As for Le Fuel, one could take issue with his decorative load, but he always perfectly mastered the very large scale of the Louvre. At the Louvre, the first floor is 10 meters high. That's 8 times the height of a room in a fine chateau or Parisian private mansion. It's absolutely gigantic.
By adding these final rooms to the ensemble, Napoleon III created a vast palatial domain of 210,000 square meters. But fate had something else in store for the Louvre. No sooner was it completed in 1871 than a huge intentional fire destroyed the Tuileries Palace, leaving the Louvre gazing out at an immense 25-hectare garden. In 1925, the museum underwent a small revolution with its new director, Henri Verne. Upon his arrival, Verne wanted to modernize the institution and, above all, unify it.
Until that time, the Louvre Museum was actually the Louvre Museums in the plural. We would talk about the Egyptian Museum, the Assyrian Museum, the Painting Museum. It had been individualized to the point where there were several separate entrances.
Henri Verne created underground passageways so visitors could move from wing to wing without having to leave the museum. A more fluid path where the collections were also better organized by theme and chronological order.
Henri Verne was also the time when electricity was installed in the palace. One of his concerns was that people who worked during the day could also come to the Louvre and enjoy it and learn from it.
Though Verne's plan was interrupted during World War II, it would remain forever engraved in people's minds.
The Grand Louvre project, launched by François Mitterrand and Jacques Lang, really crystallized a particular moment. The political desire to join up with a history that was underway.
As with every transformation for the past 8 centuries, the renovations for the Grand Louvre project promised to provide quite a challenge. The goal was to once more give the museum an entrance and edifice worthy of its collections. The Louvre, an enormous museum in the making, with the complex architecture of a palatial domain built over 800 years. That's what Ieoh Ming Pei inherited in the 1980s when he proposed to build a pyramid right in the middle of the Cour Napoléon.
The Louvre pyramid had to conserve a perception of the Louvre Palace in its whole, whereas it's a contemporary work. That was a rather delicate exercise.
A new battle awaited the architect, a technological one. The pyramid had to be completely transparent. No such structure had ever been built before. Everything had to be invented from scratch, starting with the glass, comprised of 673 panels.
We were looking for glass that was like the glass that is used when you make a wine glass or when you make spectacles. That's called white glass. But it was not available in any quantity for what we needed.
Transparency was a real challenge, since glass naturally has a slight green tint, a color produced by the iron content in sand, the main component of glass.
My father said, I cannot have that green color. I don't want the facades of the Louvre be distorted by any color at all.
To satisfy Pei's dreams of grandeur and beauty, the Saint-Gobain glass manufacturer reduced the iron content, but there was a problem. Their traditional gas furnaces weren't adapted. The 1500 degrees centigrade temperature was too high for this new, more transparent glass.
We had to use a different process. We heated the glass with electricity. That gave us more control over the temperature and heat diffusion inside the furnace.
In April 1986, after a year and a half of research, Saint-Gobain presented the glass fresh from their new electric furnace. The life-sized sample was put on display in the Cour Napoléon, in the very spot where the pyramid was to stand. It worked, and the order was approved. Another challenge awaited the manufacturer: production. December 1986, Saint-Gobain launched the fabrication of 673 panels that would compose the pyramid.
We're a heavy industry, make slabs of glass sheets. But here we were asked to provide individual units, finished units, fashioned like in silversmithery.
To satisfy the architect's high demands, workers scrutinized the 3,800 square meters of glass.
Initially, the transparent glass sheets were placed on stands where they could be examined for any flaws. It was a very serious business.
The glass sheets were then cut into rhombus-shaped segments of 3 by 1.9 meters, then glued together 2 by 2 with a light plastic film to create a double glazing.
They needed to think about safety. The words, laminated glass. In the event of breakage, the glass holds together like a car windshield.
The new laminated double glass segments, 21.5 millimeters thick, were then glued rather than bolted into an aluminum frame.
That was another innovative process at the time, which allowed us to create perfectly smooth facades.
The total weight of the 673 glass and aluminum panels, 105 tons. Quite a load to bear. Another technical challenge awaited Pei's teams: the structure of the pyramid. Pei didn't want his pyramid to obstruct the view of the Louvre Palace. Though the extra transparent glass helped with this, he also had to think of the structure of the glass walls.
We had to innovate, as the structure of the pyramid is a totally innovative structure that had not existed before.
Pei's team settled on a framework made of stainless steel, a quintessential light yet solid material.
There were conventional ways to do the pyramid structure, but they would have made it look like a prison. Big iron beams crisscrossing together. And we looked at a space frame.
It was a very difficult study in a context where, although we did have computers and calculation capacity, it was nevertheless computer technology from the late 80s.
Inside the glass pyramid, the structure echoes the rhombus-shaped grid. The strung cables and bars perpendicular to the glass are able to bear the incredible load of the glass panels. To develop the system, the engineers turned to yacht technology.
We were able to develop a system which is basically the way you hold the mast of a yacht up, where you have one pole that is in compression and then cables that are very slender that hold it from tipping over, that take it in tension.
With this ingenious system applied to the pyramid, Pei achieved the impossible feat of a structure that is both solid and transparent. In January 1988, the 95-ton steel structure, which took 9 months to put in place, was ready to accommodate the 105 tons of rhombus-shaped panels of glass and aluminum. The pyramid, chiseled like a diamond in the Cour Napoleon, was now part of the scenery.
The Louvre Pyramid is architectural audacity at the service of heritage.
Beneath the pyramid, a vast underground lobby finally gave the Louvre its heart and lungs. 9 meters deep, its walls are clad in stone, like the foundations of the palace surrounding it.
We wanted to use materials that were related to the materials that all of Paris is built with and that the Louvre Palace is built with. I spent over a year going to meet people in quarries in France, both in the Burgundy region, in the Chablis region, to find the right kind of stone. It's just beautiful, very hard, will last a long, long time.
The smooth white concrete ceiling was developed according to the same strict demands. It took 1.5 years of trials in order to hit on the right formula.
We used a special mix where we used this dust powder from the same stone we were using in the stone walls to give it that color. And we used white cement, so it didn't change the color.
Here in this temple of art, Ieoh Pei continued to play with geometric shapes. The straight lines of the escalators contrast with the spiral staircase winding around the cylindrical elevator.
Ieoh said, you must not see it when it's not there. So we had to invent an elevator that we'd never seen before.
To meet Pei's demands, the engineers designed an elevator based on the principle of a piston that retracts into a 13-meter deep well.
The constructors had to build a large, deep well, waterproof well, with a piston It then rises slowly out of the well. And so there is a platform on the end of a piston that goes up and takes you up, glides magically up, and then a little platform automatically comes out of the piston to create a bridge. That was a tour de force.
When the elevator is all the way up, it fills the central space of the staircase, but when the platform goes back down to the lobby, it disappears entirely. Decked out in all its finery, the Louvre Pyramid opens its doors on March 29, 1989.
It was nice because the criticism, there were still some people probably who didn't want to see it there, but it was there and people were liking it. And I felt strongly about this, that the pyramid should be sensed that it was a shelter over something more important.
While the glass pyramid had become the emblematic symbol of the Grand Louvre, the transformation of the palace was not yet complete. A major renovation awaited the architects, the development of the Richelieu wing with its 49,000 square meters. An area previously devoted to the Ministry of Finance and not adapted to a museum space in the least.
It had always been used for administration, so there were mezzanine offices with a height of just 3 meters. Museum rooms need to be 6, 7, or 8 meters high.
The building was transformed from 7 levels into 4 large stories. The construction site was spectacular.
It was an exceptionally huge work site. We gutted the building of the Richelieu wing, keeping only the exterior facades. It's one single volume. We broke all the floors.
Only Napoleon III's apartments were conserved. Everything else had to be rebuilt, a custom design in keeping with the artworks to be displayed here. The former ministry courtyard was transformed into a sculpture gallery, and many levels of terraces were created. The space was covered with a glass canopy that let natural light in while protecting the artworks.
We needed to develop a thin framework so the sculptures wouldn't be hacked up by shadows when there was sun. By using relatively thin cables and tubes, the shadows created are very slight and vague. They don't ruin the view of the sculptures.
In all, 165 new rooms were created. To move from floor to floor, Pei imposed, like his predecessors, his own modern-day stairway, the Richelieu escalator.
To make sure that they didn't look too much like escalators in a supermarket, we placed them between 2 stone walls, created a space with direct overhead natural lighting. It's an architectural element, not merely an element for moving about.
The inauguration of the Richelieu wing in 1993 did not mark the end of the renovations. The Grand Louvre continued its extension below the Carousel Gardens with the creation of a parking lot and a shopping center. The centerpiece of the new development, the inverted pyramid.
The pyramid is a geometrical form adapted to loads and weightlessness. But an inverted pyramid doesn't rest on the ground. Unlike the pyramid of the entrance where the glass is supported, here the glass is suspended. The glass needs to be held, otherwise it falls.
The construction of the Grand Louvre also involved the development of the Tuileries Gardens, the restoration of 11 hectares of facades, the renovation of the Louvre School, and the Decorative Arts Museum. 2 institutions independent from the Louvre Museum, but which have also kept traces of architecture from the former palaces.
The Grand Louvre is an extraordinary operation which for 15 years could have been perceived, or at least by myself as a young architect perceived it, at one time as a completion. But not at all. The Grand Louvre has already been extended.
And of the 360,000 square meters of floor space that make up the Louvre Palace, the museum still has quite a few spots in need of renovation. The Louvre, an indisputable site of historical interest. Within these walls, 800 years of French history, but also 800 years of architecture and art history.
From the infrastructures of the original fortifications to the glass pyramid, we have the complete synthesis of technical and ornamental expertise of French architecture. An open book.
In its quest for space and fluidity, the museum has dug tunnels, knocked down walls, and recovered entire portions of the palace. A largely successful gamble, yet an insufficient one.
Pei's Louvre was designed for 5 million visitors, but in no time we were up to 10. What will it be in 15 years? 25 million?
More challenges for the Louvre of the 21st century and new transformations in view.
I think that the Louvre will continually change. You know, the changes will never stop.